As of today, it's been 570 days since October 7, 2023, the day that Hamas terrorists, accompanied by 3,000 Palestinians, stormed the border to kill, to destroy, to murder, to rape, to burn, to behead beautiful, beautiful human beings. A beautiful music festival. The young people who came there to enjoy, to celebrate life, was only to be murdered and killed. The horrific scenes from that day is resemblance of what happened during the Holocaust, and some say even worse. But many of us, we jump to conclusions very quickly. The expression ignorance is bliss is not always correct. Many of us are very ignorant about Gaza. Where is Gaza? Well, we know it's a border town with Israel, but what is the history of Gaza? So I think perhaps it's time for us to spend a few minutes to learn the history of Gaza, lest you be educated, so you could be in the know and knowledgeable of what this war is about and what Gaza means to Israel, what Gaza meant to Israel in the past, what it means to Israel today. So please join me in a short history lesson about Gaza. You would be very well informed and very well educated by listening through this whole presentation about what and where is Gaza, what does Gaza mean to us, and what does it mean to you.
Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. I'd like to take a few minutes to go through a quick review of Gaza in Jewish history and just get a very basic sense of the long stretch of interaction between the people of Gaza and the Jews in various periods from antiquity to the present. First of all, where exactly is Gaza? You can see it here. I'm sure you've seen it on newscasts and on the internet. It's a little strip of land just on the Mediterranean coast in Israel's southwest. It's about 28 miles long, or 45 kilometers, and it's only about 3 to 4.5 miles wide, 5 to 7 kilometers. It has a very, very long history. It goes all the way back to the Bronze Age, where it was primarily an Egyptian base and an administrative center in the land of Canaan. That is well before the Jews appeared on the scene, the Israelites appeared on the scene. It was, under Joshua, as described in the Bible, assigned to the tribe of Judah, although it really remained under the control of the Canaanites and then later under specifically the Philistines in the 12th century before the Common Era. The Philistines, in Hebrew the Pelishtim, are of course the etymological origins of the Palestinians today. That term Philistine in English, or Pelishtim in Hebrew, was later adopted by the Romans in their attempt to erase Jewish memory from the region, and they named the entire land Palestina. That's where the Arabs get the word Philistine from the Roman borrowing of this 12th century people living there. Of course, we have lots and lots of biblical stories about the conflict between the Pelishtim and the Jews. If you have a look, for example, in the book of Samuel, it's constantly going back and forth. I think one of the most dramatic elements of Gaza specifically is the scene in which the judge Samson is taken captive and brought back to the temple of Dagon in Gaza, what would be, I guess, Gaza City today. And he is publicly humiliated. They didn't have social media back then, but they blinded him and they strapped him to the pillars of this temple. And he had this great prayer to God that he should have strength one more time, and he pulled down the pillars of the temple and destroyed all the people in it. Useful required reading for Hamas right now. The region, although it was basically independent from areas under Israelite control, it was briefly conquered by King David. King Hezekiah, King Alexander Yanai in the Maccabean period, the Hashmonayim, and even under King Herod. But the Talmud considers it as not technically part of the borders of the land of Israel. It's always been somewhat separate and recognized for its distinctiveness. That doesn't mean, however, that Jews did not live in Gaza. In fact, we have a very, very long history of Jews being in Gaza. We have some great archaeological discoveries, such as a synagogue there dating from the early 6th century of the Common Era. You can see that they have actually a representation of King David here, labeled in Hebrew. And it's clear that Jews lived in Gaza after the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. It tended to drop, the Jewish population dropped after the Crusaders entered in the 12th century, but basically began to grow again in the 14th through the 17th centuries. It was only in the 20th century when the Jewish population there finally disappeared, and that was primarily because of the uprisings in 1929, a lot of conflict between Arabs and Jews in the Yishuv movement, that is before Israel became a state, and Jews decided to leave Gaza at that time. So when you get up to 1948, which is of course a crucial period in the history of the region, you have about 20,000 people living in Gaza. The vast majority of them are Muslims. There are only about 720 Christians. It was under the British mandate, and they had handed it over to the United Nations for a solution, and they came up with this kind of bizarre plan to divide what would become the state of Israel into 7 pieces. 3 of them would be Arab, 3 of them would be Jewish, and Jerusalem would be a international zone. As is well known, the Arab nations surrounding the future state of Israel refused to accept this UN plan, and they attacked. And this resulted in the very bloody War of Independence. Amazingly, the state of Israel was not only able to maintain itself, to not have all the Jews pushed into the sea, but they actually even consolidated their territory somewhat. Gaza, however, was left under Egyptian control. The Arab population of the Gaza Strip expanded tremendously as tens of thousands of Arabs fled the conflict and made their way into Gaza. So it expanded to about 88,000, and then after the armistice, it actually ballooned to 360,000, which is characteristic of the Gaza Strip. It is a phenomenally overpopulated piece of land. There were 8 refugees camps set up in Gaza for these 1948-49 refugees, and they largely remain there to this day. The area is plagued by huge unemployment. Gazans were not allowed to work even in Egypt until 1952, and the unemployment rate was hovering around 50% at that time. Terrorist attacks from Gaza into Israel prompt Israel to briefly conquer the period in November of 1956 and then to retreat in 1957 once diplomatic arrangements were made. Unquestionably, however, the most significant date in the history of Gaza and its relations to the land of Israel is June of 1967, when the remarkable Six-Day War occurred. In 1967, Israel was preparing for a massive attack by the Arab armies that surrounded it, particularly from Egypt and from Syria. So they launched a preemptive strike, and largely using superior air power, they were able to expand the borders of the state of Israel dramatically, encompassing the entire Sinai Peninsula, the region that had been controlled by Jordan, called the West Bank, and the Golan Heights to the north. The Gaza Strip, of course, was also now part of the region that the state of Israel was responsible for. However, and this is really crucial, the state of Israel had to determine what it was going to do with these territories. Some territories were annexed, meaning they were made part of Israel permanently. That includes East Jerusalem, for obvious reasons, because that is the historical capital of the Jewish people, and the Golan Heights in the north, which had a significant military advantage because it overlooks Damascus and it also overlooks the Galilee from the other side. So controlling that was considered very significant. But the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were not annexed. And they were rather occupied. And there was a lot of mixed thoughts in Israel about what to do about these territories. A large body of public opinion felt that now that Israel had really demonstrated that it was here to stay, then the Arabs would then come to the negotiating table and they would be able to exchange land for peace. Surprisingly, that did not happen until 1978, when President Anwar Sadat of Egypt made a very heroic gesture and essentially traveled to Israel, met with Menachem Begin, the prime minister, and together with the work of President Jimmy Carter, they hammered out the Camp David Accords in 1978. As part of the Camp David Accords, this is very important for our purposes, the entire Sinai Peninsula was given back to Egypt. So Israel controlled it from 67 till 78 and then gave it back in exchange for a peace with Egypt, which has basically held. There have been some moments of tension, including in our own times, but nevertheless, it's basically a peace that is held. But the thing is, Egypt did not want to take the Gaza Strip. By this point, in the late 1970s, Palestinian national sensibilities had grown significantly. They were associated with a lot of terrorist activities around the world, in airports and at the Munich Olympics and so on, and the Egyptians simply didn't want to have anything to deal with it. And so Israel was kind of left holding the bag, forced to maintain this piece of territory with a very hostile population, with very poor employment, and with very poor economic prospects. Things looked a little better for the possibility of a two-state solution with the Oslo Accords in 1994-95, when the Palestinian Authority was established, which theoretically gave Palestinians a degree of self-rule within both the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. However, that has failed to take sufficient hold for reasons which are beyond the scope of this narrow video. Ultimately, however, by 2005, the Israelis had realized that maintaining the Gaza Strip was militarily simply too costly, and that with the demographic imbalance, because the Gazans have very large families and there's an inverted age pyramid with a very, very young population there, and with continued unemployment, it would simply be untenable. And although there had been some very successful Jewish enterprises and settlements established within Gaza, in a period of tremendous national turmoil, Ariel Sharon ordered a disengagement, or simply a retreat from Gaza, and all of those Israeli settlements were removed. And what that meant was, from 2005, Gaza was technically independent. It was not part of Israel, and they could run their internal affairs however they liked. We will get to the blockade shortly. But the Gazans turned around, and between September and January, they had their elections. They pushed out Fatah, which is the somewhat more mainstream Palestinian movement that is associated more now with the West Bank. And they elected Hamas, a organization recognized as a terrorist organization by most Western nations, including the United States, and Hamas has been in power ever since. So now Israel had a very, very difficult kind of situation. They had literally a terrorist state on their borders, a state that was dedicated to the destruction of Israel's very existence, and Israel had to figure out how they were going to have these very, very hostile neighbors. The blockade was intended to make sure that the Gazans under Hamas could not import weapons, and then later so they could not import secondary materials that could be made into weapons. That has proved to be not very successful, because Hamas has taken much of the foreign aid that is poured into Gaza, humanitarian aid in many cases, and has diverted it to building more and more rockets. And in fact, rockets are the primary way in which Gaza interacted with Israel, that and the use of work permits. After 1967, there was actually a period of some prosperity for Gaza, as in an attempt to develop some kind of normalcy, some kind of relationship with this population, Israel allowed Gazans to work in the country, and they issued thousands upon thousands of work permits. In 1971, 32.7% of Gazans worked in Israel, and the unemployment rate was almost zero. By 1979, the number of Gazans working in Israel had risen to 42.4%, and by 1996, it was at 46.1%. It was a steady increase of economic interrelationship between Israel and Gaza. The Gazans were largely working in menial labor and construction and things like that, but nevertheless, there was at least funds flowing into the region. In 1987, however, things exploded with the First Intifada, which was kind of a Palestinian expression of disgust at the lack of progress that they had made towards statehood. And Israel, responding to many of these violent demonstrations, began cutting down on the work permits. By 1993, the percentage of Gazans working in Israel had been reduced to 26.5%, basically half of what it was in 1986. But suicide attacks increased, and in 1994 and 1995, horrific bus bombings and things like that, orchestrated from Gaza, meant that the number of Gazans who were allowed to work in Israel reduced to 3.3%. Now, this is the part that I think is especially significant for what we're enduring today. According to what I think is some quite insightful reporting by Reuters, Israel is apparently caught off guard because they were kind of lulled into a sense of security, thinking that, hey, things were getting better. It looked like the Gazans were beginning to realize that, working for a living and building your home is much better than trying to destroy it with barbarism and with war. And in fact, the number of work permits that were given to Gazans was going to be increasing. And so Israel seems to have let its guard down, thinking that maybe we're slowly, like we are with many countries in the region, maybe we're finally getting to a normal kind of relationship, but that in fact was not the case because Hamas was still in control. Hamas, throughout this period, has been launching rockets, particularly at cities in the south like Sderot, and with newer technologies beginning to reach further north like Tel Aviv and even Jerusalem. And although the Israelis countered with the development of a remarkable device, the Iron Dome, which is the equivalent of hitting a moving bullet with another bullet, that essentially blunted the impact of much of the rocket fire. But then the Gazans under Hamas began to use the strategy of kidnapping. In particular, Gilad Shalit was kidnapped in 2006, was held for 5 years, and because of the Israelis' vaunted opinion that no soldier should ever be left behind, they actually negotiated a controversial deal of releasing 1,027 Palestinian prisoners, some of whom had been jailed for violent terrorist crimes, in order to get back Gilad Shalit. And that's basically where we are today going into this particular conflict. Hamas has clearly learned that the Israelis are sensitive to kidnapping, that Israelis value their population, and that they want to get their people back. And all I can see from a historical perspective is that Hamas worships death and wants to increase the suffering of their population. Rather than pursuing the route of working towards prosperity, it seems that all of their energy is going to more and more bombs, more and more violence. I hope you found this video useful.
Now you have heard it. You have experienced the history of what has gone on in Gaza. Now that you perhaps have filled in some gaps in your knowledge, you'll be a little more sensitive and understanding of what this war is all about. Israel does not want war, does not need war. Israel would do anything to end this war as soon as possible because we worship life and not death. The world needs to unite and understand and realize that life on this world is a privilege. We don't take it for granted. Every day we wake up and we're able to function is a gift and a miracle, what we are to be thankful for and grateful for. Life is so sacred. Life is so holy. How dare we for a second jeopardize another person's right to live, to continue living in this world. As long as the axis of evil is still sworn to the annihilation of Israel in the Western countries, unfortunately, war will continue. But when the world, who is a lot more on the right side of history than on the wrong side of history, comes together, unites together, and each one of us has a voice, a little bit of light pushes away a lot of darkness, so much more so a lot of light. So now that we know the history of Gaza, you can appreciate the struggle. You can appreciate what it's like to have a neighbor right on your border who's every day promising to reenact October 7 once again. How important it is for us to eradicate them from amongst us and try to find some semblance of peace and harmony so that the citizens of Gaza could rehabilitate and begin becoming productive citizens instead of productive terrorists. Let's pray and hope that that happens speedily in our days. God bless you. God loves you.